Hello and welcome to Night Historian. Tonight we turn our attention to a place where the medieval world achieved something that would not be replicated for centuries. A system of production so refined, so methodical, that it could deliver a complete warship in a single day. This is not the story of a single invention or a brilliant mind. Rather, it is the account of how an entire city reorganized itself around a fundamental question. How does one build power at scale? The year was 1104. A merchant fleet had been destroyed in battle, and the Republic of Venice faced a crisis that threatened its survival. The city depended entirely on maritime commerce and naval strength. Without ships, it had no trade routes. Without trade routes, it had no wealth. Without wealth, it had no defense. The mathematics of the problem were brutal and unforgiving. The city needed not one replacement vessel, but dozens, perhaps hundreds. The traditional method of shipbuilding, one craftsman, one ship, months of labour, could not meet this demand. Something fundamental had to change. What emerged from this necessity was not merely a new workshop. It was a complete reimagining of how human labour could be organised, how knowledge could be standardized, how production itself could be transformed into something predictable and measurable. The Arsenal of Venice became the first true factory of the medieval world, and in its organisation lay the seeds of everything that would follow: the Industrial Revolution, assembly line manufacturing, the modern corporation itself. To understand what the Arsenal accomplished, one must first understand what Venice was. The city occupied a peculiar position in the medieval Mediterranean. It was not a kingdom with vast agricultural lands. It possessed no significant natural resources. Its only advantage was geography, a cluster of islands in a lagoon, protected from invasion, positioned at the crossroads of trade between Europe and the Islamic world, between the Mediterranean and the routes that led to Asia. Venice's entire existence depended on movement of goods, movement of people, movement of information, movement of capital. This obsession with movement shaped everything about Venetian society. The city developed a merchant class unlike anything else in Europe. These were not feudal lords tied to land. They were traders, investors, risk-takers. They understood mathematics, accounting, contract law. They kept meticulous records. They calculated profit and loss with precision. They thought in terms of efficiency and return on investment centuries before such concepts had names. The Arsenal emerged from this mercantile culture, but it also transformed it. The word itself derives from the Arabic Dar al-Sinar, meaning house of manufacture. The Venetians borrowed not just the word, but the underlying concept, that production could be centralized, controlled, and optimized. Yet what they built went far beyond anything the Islamic world had created. The Arsenal became something entirely new. The site itself occupied roughly 60 acres on the eastern edge of Venice's lagoon. It was surrounded by high walls and guarded gates. Only authorized workers could enter. The perimeter was controlled with a rigor that resembled a military installation more than a workshop. This was deliberate. The Arsenal contained state secrets, techniques, designs, organizational methods that gave Venice its competitive advantage. The knowledge that flowed through those gates was as valuable as the ships that emerged from them. The physical layout of the Arsenal reflected a profound understanding of workflow and efficiency. The facility was not a random collection of buildings. Every structure occupied a specific position in a carefully planned sequence. Raw materials entered at one point, finished ships departed from another. Between these two endpoints lay a series of specialized workshops, each dedicated to a particular function. The timber yards occupied one section. The rope-making facilities occupied another. The sail-making workshops stood in their own area. The blacksmiths worked in a separate zone, their forges kept away from the woodworking areas to prevent fire. This spatial organization was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate decision to break the shipbuilding process into discrete, manageable components. Rather than having individual, craftsmen build entire ships from start to finish, the arsenal divided the labour into specific tasks. One group of workers shaped the hull, another group attached the planking, a third group installed the internal framework, a fourth group prepared the rigging. Each group became experts in their particular function. Each group worked in a dedicated space designed for their specific task. The implications of this arrangement were profound, though the people living through it could not have fully grasped them. They were witnessing the birth of something that would eventually reshape human civilization. They were watching the transition from craft production to industrial production. The difference was not merely one of scale. It was a difference in how knowledge was organized, how labor was valued, how the relationship between worker and product was understood. In the traditional craft system, a master shipbuilder possessed comprehensive knowledge of the entire process. He understood timber selection, hull design, joinery, rigging, everything. An apprentice learned by working alongside this master over many years, gradually absorbing knowledge through observation and practice. The quality of the finished ship reflected the skill and judgment of the master. The process could not be rushed. It could not be standardized. Each ship was unique, bearing the imprint of the craftsman who created it. The arsenal operated on a fundamentally different principle. The knowledge required to build a ship was decomposed into smaller, more manageable units. A worker in the timber yard did not need to understand how rigging worked. A worker in the rope-making facility did not need to understand hull design. Each worker needed to master only their specific function. This meant that training time could be dramatically reduced. A person could become competent at their assigned task in weeks or months rather than years. The arsenal could therefore employ a much larger workforce, and that workforce could be more easily replaced if a worker left or became unable to work. This transformation in labour organisation had profound consequences that extended far beyond shipbuilding. It meant that production could be scaled up or down based on demand. It meant that the quality of output could be more easily controlled and standardized. It meant that productivity could be measured and compared. It meant that the process itself could be continuously refined and improved. These principles would eventually become the foundation of modern industrial manufacturing, but they were revolutionary in the medieval context. The arsenal also represented a new relationship between the state and production. Venice's government did not merely commission ships from private craftsmen. Instead, it created a state-owned facility that directly controlled the means of production. The arsenal employed hundreds of workers on a permanent basis. The government provided them with tools, materials, and workspace. In return, the workers provided their labour according to established rules and procedures. This arrangement created a new category of worker, the Arsenalotti, the arsenal workers, who occupied a unique position in Venetian society. The Arsenalotti were not independent craftsmen. They were not servants or slaves. They occupied a middle ground that would eventually become familiar as the industrial working class. They sold their labour for wages. They worked according to schedules and procedures established by management. They had no ownership stake in the products they created, yet they also possessed certain protections and privileges. They received regular payment. They had some job security. They could organise collectively to protect their interests. In many ways, the Arsenalotti pioneered the relationship between workers and employers that would become standard in the industrial age. The arsenal's emergence in the early 12th century marked a turning point in how human societies organised production. It demonstrated that large-scale manufacturing was possible without relying on slave labour or feudal obligation. It showed that complex products could be created through the coordinated efforts of many workers, each performing specialised tasks. It proved that standardization and efficiency could be achieved through careful planning and systematic organisation. These lessons would take centuries to spread beyond Venice, but once they did, they would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human civilization. By the early 13th century, the arsenal had grown into a sprawling complex that occupied nearly 100 acres. The facility contained over 100 buildings, each serving a distinct purpose within the larger manufacturing system. To enter the arsenal was to step into a world organized by logic rather than tradition. Every element of the physical space reflected decisions about efficiency, workflow, and control. The timber yards formed the first major section. Here, wood arrived from forests across the Adriatic and beyond. Venice controlled trade routes that brought timber from the Balkans, from the Alps, from territories as far as the Black Sea. The arsenal required enormous quantities of wood: oak for the hull, pine for the planking, fir for the masts. The timber yards employed specialists who understood wood selection with remarkable precision. They could identify which trees produced the strongest wood for specific purposes. They knew how to season timber properly, how to detect flaws, how to calculate how much usable material could be extracted from each log. The wood did not simply arrive and get used immediately. The arsenal maintained vast stockpiles, organized by type and quality. Some timber aged for years before use. This was not waste. The arsenal's managers understood that properly aged wood performed better than green wood. They had learned through experience and experimentation which storage methods produced superior results. The timber yards therefore functioned as both a processing facility and a storage system, with careful records maintained about what materials were available and where they were located. From the timber yards, wood moved to the sawing section. Here the arsenal employed workers whose sole responsibility involved cutting logs into planks of standardized dimensions. This standardization represented a crucial innovation. In traditional shipbuilding, each craftsman might cut wood to slightly different specifications based on his judgment and experience. In the arsenal, all planks of a particular type measured the same thickness, the same width, the same length. This uniformity made assembly faster and more reliable. A worker installing planks did not need to adjust each one individually. They fit together predictably. The standardization extended beyond mere dimensions. The arsenal developed detailed specifications for every component that went into a ship. These specifications were recorded in written form and consulted by workers throughout the production process. Historians still debate exactly how detailed these specifications were and how systematically they were applied, but the evidence suggests that the arsenal maintained something resembling what modern manufacturers would call blueprints or technical drawings. Workers could reference these documents to understand precisely what they needed to produce. The hull construction section occupied a central position within the arsenal's layout. Here, the actual assembly of the ship's frame took place. The process began with the keel, the central structural element that ran the length of the vessel. Workers shaped the keel according to specifications, then positioned it in a building designed specifically for this purpose. The building contained a slipway, an inclined track that would eventually allow the completed ship to be launched into the water. The keel was secured to this slipway, providing a stable foundation for the work that followed. Once the keel was in place, workers began attaching the ribs, the curved wooden pieces that formed the ship's skeleton. This required considerable skill. Each rib had to be shaped to match the keel's contours and to create the proper hull shape. The arsenal employed master craftsmen who possessed this knowledge, but they did not work alone. They worked alongside less skilled labourers who performed the more routine tasks. The master craftsmen made the critical decisions about shape and fit. The labourers performed the repetitive work of fastening and securing. The planking section came next. Once the hull's frame was complete, workers attached the wooden planks that formed the ship's outer skin. This was where standardization proved particularly valuable. Because all planks measured the same dimensions, the process of attachment could be systematized. Workers knew exactly how many planks they needed, how they should overlap, how they should be fastened. The work proceeded in a predictable sequence, moving from the keel upward along the hull's sides. The fastening itself represented another area where the arsenal had developed standardized procedures. Ships required thousands of wooden pegs and iron nails to hold the planks in place. The arsenal did not leave the production of these fasteners to chance. Dedicated workshops produced pegs and nails according to specifications. The blacksmiths who worked in the ironworking section produced nails of consistent size and quality. The carpenters who produced wooden pegs followed established procedures. This meant that the workers assembling the hull could rely on having the right fasteners available in the right quantities. The rigging section operated somewhat differently from the hull construction area. While the hull required substantial carpentry skill, rigging involved different expertise. The arsenal maintained separate workshops where workers prepared masts, yards, and the complex system of ropes that controlled the sails. The rope-making facility was particularly significant. The arsenal required enormous quantities of rope, hundreds of miles of it annually. The rope-making workshops employed dozens of workers who did nothing but produce rope according to established specifications. The rope-making process itself had been standardized and systematized. Workers twisted fibers into rope using equipment that had been refined over generations. The thickness of the rope, the tightness of the twist, the materials used, all followed established procedures. Different types of rope served different purposes. Some rope needed to be particularly strong. Other rope needed to be flexible. The arsenal produced multiple varieties, each meeting specific requirements. Workers could identify which type of rope was needed for which purpose, and they produced it accordingly. The sail-making workshops occupied their own section of the arsenal. Here, workers cut and sewed canvas into sails according to standardized patterns. The arsenal maintained templates for different sail sizes and shapes. These templates allowed workers to cut canvas consistently, ensuring that sails from different production runs would fit together properly. The sewing itself followed established procedures. Workers knew exactly how to stitch the seams to create sails that could withstand the stresses of maritime use. The caulking section performed a critical function that determined whether a ship would remain seaworthy or sink. Caulking involved filling the gaps between planks with a mixture of fibers and tar to prevent water from entering the hull. This required skill and judgment. The caulker had to understand how much material to use, how tightly to pack it, how to apply the tar. The arsenal employed experienced caulkers who trained less skilled workers in the basic procedures. The process could not be entirely mechanized or routinized, but the arsenal had still managed to establish procedures that produced consistent results. The assembly section brought together all these components into a functioning ship. This was where the various specialized workshops' outputs converged. Workers in the assembly section did not create individual components. Instead, they coordinated the arrival of different parts and oversaw their integration into the complete vessel. This required careful planning and scheduling. Materials had to arrive in the correct sequence. Workers from different sections had to coordinate their efforts. The process had to proceed according to a predetermined schedule. The launching section prepared completed ships for their departure from the arsenal. This involved final inspections, the installation of equipment and supplies, and the actual movement of the ship from the building where it had been constructed to the water where it would be used. The launching itself presented a significant technical challenge. A completed warship weighed hundreds of tons. Moving it from a building to the water required careful planning and specialized equipment. The arsenal had developed procedures for this process, using systems of ropes and pulleys to move ships along the slipways. Throughout all these sections, the arsenal maintained systems of management and control. Supervisors oversaw the work in each area. They ensured that workers followed established procedures. They maintained records of materials used and work completed. They reported to higher-level managers who coordinated the entire facility's operations. This hierarchical structure allowed the arsenal to function as a coordinated system rather than as a collection of independent workshops. Every section understood its role in the larger process. Every worker understood what they needed to accomplish and when they needed to accomplish it. The arsenal's physical organization reflected a sophisticated understanding of workflow and efficiency. Materials moved through the facility in a logical sequence. Specialized sections handled specific tasks. Workers in each section developed expertise in their particular function. The entire system operated according to established procedures and schedules. This was not merely a larger version of traditional shipbuilding. It represented a fundamentally different approach to organizing production, one that would eventually become the model for industrial manufacturing throughout the world. The arsenal's success depended not merely on its physical structure or its standardized procedures, but on the people who worked within it. By the 14th century, the arsenal employed approximately 2,000 workers on a permanent basis. This represented an enormous concentration of labour in a single location, unprecedented in the medieval world. These workers, known as the Arsenalotti, formed a distinct social class within Venetian society, occupying a position that had no clear precedent in medieval Europe. The Arsenalotti came from diverse backgrounds. Some were skilled craftsmen who had trained for years to master their particular trade. Others were labourers with minimal training who performed routine tasks. The arsenal employed carpenters, blacksmiths, ropers, sailmakers, caulkers, sawyers, and dozens of other specialised workers. It also employed unskilled labourers who moved materials, cleaned work areas, and performed whatever tasks supervisors assigned them. This diversity of skill levels allowed the arsenal to function as an integrated system. Highly skilled workers focused on tasks that required expertise. Less skilled workers handled routine work. The arsenal developed a formal system for recruiting and training workers. Young men seeking employment could apply to work in the facility. If accepted, they began as apprentices or labourers, performing simple tasks under supervision. Those who demonstrated aptitude and reliability could advance to more skilled positions. The arsenal maintained records of workers' performance and capabilities. Supervisors evaluated workers regularly. Those who performed well received better assignments and higher wages. Those who performed poorly faced demotion or dismissal. This system created incentives for workers to perform their jobs competently and to develop their skills. The wages paid to Arsenalotti workers varied considerably based on skill level and experience. Master craftsmen earned substantially more than unskilled labourers. A master carpenter might earn 3 or 4 times what an unskilled labourer earned. However, even the lowest paid Arsenalotti workers earned more than many other medieval workers. The arsenal offered regular employment and predictable income. For workers from poor backgrounds, this represented a significant improvement over the precarious existence of day labourers or agricultural workers. The arsenal therefore attracted ambitious young men seeking to improve their circumstances. The arsenal also offered something beyond mere wages. Workers received certain benefits and protections that were unusual for the medieval period. The arsenal provided tools and materials. Workers did not need to purchase their own equipment. The arsenal maintained workshops that were relatively safe and well organised compared to other medieval workplaces. The arsenal provided some medical care for injured workers. Most significantly, the arsenal offered job security. Workers who performed their duties competently could expect to retain their positions. This was not guaranteed employment in the modern sense, but it represented a level of stability that most medieval workers could not expect. The Arsenalotti developed a strong sense of collective identity. They recognized themselves as a distinct group within Venetian society, neither masters nor servants, but skilled workers employed by the state. This collective identity eventually manifested in organized action. By the 15th century, the Arsenalotti had begun to organize collectively to protect their interests. They negotiated with arsenal management over wages and working conditions. They coordinated their actions to resist what they perceived as unjust treatment. In some cases, they refused to work until their demands were met. These actions represented early forms of labour organisation, predating the modern labour movement by centuries. The arsenal's management structure reflected the complexity of coordinating thousands of workers. At the top stood the Provveditori dell'Arsenale, 3 officials appointed by the Venetian government to oversee the facility. These officials made major decisions about production schedules, hiring, and resource allocation. Below them stood a hierarchy of supervisors and foremen who managed specific sections of the arsenal. Each major workshop had a master craftsman who oversaw the work in that area. Below the masters stood journeymen and apprentices who performed the actual labour. This hierarchical structure served multiple functions. It allowed coordination of the arsenal's complex operations. It established clear lines of authority and responsibility. It created a system through which decisions made at the top could be communicated to workers throughout the facility. It also created opportunities for advancement. A talented worker could potentially rise from labourer to journeyman to master craftsman, eventually achieving a position of authority and responsibility. This possibility of advancement motivated workers to perform well and to develop their skills. The arsenal maintained detailed records of its operations. Supervisors recorded the work completed in each section. They tracked materials used and materials wasted. They recorded worker attendance and performance. They maintained inventories of finished components and materials in storage. These records served multiple purposes. They allowed management to monitor productivity and identify inefficiencies. They provided accountability. Supervisors could demonstrate what work they had accomplished and what resources they had consumed. They created a historical record that allowed the arsenal to learn from past experience and improve future operations. The standardization of work procedures extended to how workers were trained and evaluated. The arsenal developed formal procedures for teaching workers their assigned tasks. Master craftsmen instructed apprentices in the techniques and procedures they needed to master. Supervisors ensured that workers followed established procedures. The arsenal evaluated workers based on whether they produced work that met established standards. A worker who produced planks that measured the correct dimensions and had no significant defects performed their job well. A worker who produced planks that were warped or undersized performed their job poorly. This objective evaluation system reduced the role of personal favoritism or arbitrary judgment. The arsenal also developed procedures for handling disputes and disciplining workers who violated rules. If a worker failed to perform their duties adequately, supervisors could impose penalties ranging from wage reductions to dismissal. If a worker engaged in theft or sabotage, they faced severe punishment. The arsenal maintained order through a combination of incentives and punishments. Workers who performed well received higher wages and better assignments. Workers who performed poorly faced consequences. This system created a workplace culture that emphasized competence, reliability, and obedience to established procedures. The arsenal employed workers on a year-round basis, which represented another significant innovation. In most medieval crafts, work was seasonal. Construction workers found employment primarily in summer months. Agricultural workers laboured intensively during harvest season. The arsenal, by contrast, maintained a permanent workforce that worked throughout the year. This allowed the facility to maintain continuous production. It also provided workers with year-round employment and income. The arsenal could accomplish this because it produced ships according to a planned schedule, not in response to random customer demand. The government determined how many ships needed to be built each year and allocated resources accordingly. The arsenal's approach to labour organisation influenced how other Venetian industries developed. Shipbuilding was not the only major industry in Venice. The city also produced textiles, glass and other goods. Over time, these industries adopted organisational principles similar to those used in the arsenal. They standardised production procedures. They broke complex manufacturing processes into specialised tasks. They employed permanent workforces. They maintained hierarchical management structures. Venice became a model for how production could be organised efficiently, and other cities gradually adopted similar approaches. The relationship between the arsenal and its workers was not without tension. Workers sometimes resisted what they perceived as excessive demands or unfair treatment. Management sometimes viewed workers as unreliable or prone to theft and sabotage. Yet despite these tensions, the system functioned effectively for centuries. The arsenal maintained production levels that allowed Venice to build the naval forces necessary to maintain its power and protect its trade routes. Workers earned better wages than they could obtain elsewhere. The government obtained the ships it needed to defend its interests. The system benefited all parties, even if the benefits were distributed unequally. The Arsenalotti represented something new in medieval society, a permanent, organized working class employed by the state to perform specialized labor according to standardized procedures. They were not craftsmen in the traditional sense, maintaining control over their work and their products. They were not servants or slaves, lacking all rights and protections. They occupied a middle ground that would eventually become familiar as industrial society developed. They sold their labor for wages. They worked according to procedures established by management. They had limited control over their work. Yet they also possessed certain protections and the possibility of advancement. In many respects, the Arsenalotti pioneered the relationship between workers and employers that would become standard in the industrial age. The actual process of building a ship in the arsenal followed a carefully choreographed sequence that had been refined over generations. Understanding this sequence reveals how the facility achieved its remarkable productivity. The process did not begin with construction. It began with planning and preparation, activities that occurred long before workers touched timber or tools. Each year, the Venetian government determined how many ships the arsenal needed to produce. This decision reflected political calculations about military needs, trade requirements, and available resources. Once the government established the production target, arsenal managers developed a schedule. They calculated how many workers they needed in each section. They determined what materials they needed to acquire. They planned the sequence in which ships would move through the facility. This planning process ensured that the arsenal could operate efficiently throughout the year. The acquisition of materials began months before actual construction commenced. The arsenal maintained agents throughout the Mediterranean and beyond who identified timber sources and negotiated purchases. Timber arrived by ship and was unloaded at the arsenal's docks. The timber yards received these shipments and began the process of sorting and storage. Different types of timber served different purposes. Oak, which was strong and durable, went to the hull construction section. Pine, which was lighter and more flexible, went to the planking section. Fir, which was straight and tall, went to the mast-making section. The timber yards organized materials by type and quality, creating an inventory system that allowed supervisors to know exactly what materials were available. Once adequate timber supplies had been accumulated, the actual construction process could begin. The first phase involved preparing the keel and the basic hull frame. Workers in the hull construction section selected timber pieces that met specifications for the keel. They shaped these pieces using hand tools, saws, chisels, planes, guided by master craftsmen who understood the precise dimensions required. The shaping process required skill. The keel had to be perfectly straight and properly dimensioned. Any deviation from specifications would compromise the entire ship's integrity. Once the keel was shaped and ready, workers moved it to the building where it would be assembled into a complete ship. The keel was positioned on the slipway, the inclined track that would eventually allow the finished ship to be launched. The keel was secured in place using wooden blocks and supports. This foundation established the reference point for all subsequent work. Every other component of the ship would be positioned relative to the keel. The next phase involved constructing the hull frame, the ribs and internal structural elements that gave the ship its shape. Master craftsmen selected timber pieces for the ribs and shaped them to the correct dimensions and curves. The ribs had to match the keel's contours and create the proper hull shape. This required considerable expertise. The craftsmen used templates and measuring devices to ensure accuracy, but they also relied on experience and judgment. A master craftsman could look at a piece of timber and visualize how it needed to be shaped to fit properly into the hull structure. As the ribs were completed, they were transported to the assembly building and attached to the keel. Workers fastened the ribs using wooden pegs and iron nails, produced in the Arsenal's specialized workshops. The fastening process followed established procedures. Workers knew exactly how many fasteners to use and how to position them. The work proceeded systematically, moving from the keel outward along the hull's length. As each rib was attached, the ship's basic shape became visible. Once the hull frame was complete, the planking phase began. This involved covering the frame with wooden planks that formed the ship's outer skin. The planks came from the soaring section, all cut to standardized dimensions. Workers selected planks in the correct sequence and attached them to the hull frame. The planks overlapped slightly, creating a strong, watertight skin. The overlapping pattern followed established procedures. Workers knew exactly how much overlap was required and how to position each plank relative to the others. The attachment of planks required enormous quantities of fasteners. The Arsenal's blacksmiths and carpenters produced thousands of nails and pegs for each ship. These fasteners arrived at the assembly building in organized batches. Workers used them according to established procedures. The standardization of fastener sizes and the planks' standardized dimensions meant that the work could proceed predictably. A worker installing planks did not need to make complex decisions about how to fit them together. The standardization had already determined how the work should be done. The caulking phase followed the completion of planking. Caulkers examined the seams between planks and filled them with a mixture of fibers and tar. This process required skill and judgment. The caulker had to determine how much material to use and how tightly to pack it. Too little material and water would seep through the seams. Too much material and the seams would be unnecessarily thick and heavy. The caulkers had learned through experience how to judge these matters correctly. They worked methodically, moving along the hull and filling every seam. While the hull construction proceeded, other sections of the Arsenal worked on components that would eventually be integrated into the completed ship. The mast-making section shaped and prepared masts. The rope-making section produced the thousands of feet of rope needed for the rigging. The sail-making section cut and sewed canvas into sails. The blacksmiths produced iron fittings and hardware. All these components were produced according to schedules that ensured they would be ready when needed for assembly. The rigging phase brought together all these components. Once the hull was complete and caulked, workers began installing the internal framework that supported the masts and rigging. They positioned the masts in their sockets. They attached the yards, the horizontal spars from which the sails hung. They began installing the complex system of ropes that controlled the sails and supported the masts. This phase required coordination among workers from different sections. The rope maker's products had to arrive when needed. The sail maker's sails had to be ready for installation. The blacksmith's hardware had to fit properly into the positions where it was needed. The installation of rigging represented one of the most complex phases of the construction process. The rigging system involved hundreds of individual ropes, each serving a specific function. Some ropes held the masts in place, others controlled the sails. Still others served as safety lines or had other specialized purposes. Workers had to understand which rope went where and how it should be attached. The Arsenal maintained detailed diagrams and specifications for the rigging system. Workers could reference these documents to understand exactly what they needed to accomplish. The final phases of construction involved installing equipment, supplies, and fittings that made the ship functional. Workers installed the steering mechanism. They installed storage areas for supplies and cargo. They installed equipment for navigation and communication. They painted or sealed the wood to protect it from rot and deterioration. They conducted inspections to ensure that all components were properly installed and functioning correctly. The launching phase represented the culmination of months of labour. The completed ship, now weighing hundreds of tons, had to be moved from the building where it had been constructed to the water where it would float. The Arsenal had developed sophisticated procedures for this process. The ship rested on the slipway, the inclined track that led to the water. Workers removed the wooden blocks and supports that had held the ship in place during construction. They positioned ropes and pulleys to control the ship's descent. They gradually released the ship, allowing it to slide down the slipway toward the water. The launching itself was a dramatic moment. The ship, released from its supports, accelerated down the slipway. Workers controlled its descent using ropes and friction devices. The ship entered the water with considerable force, creating a large splash. Once in the water, the ship floated. Workers in boats guided it to a dock where final preparations could be completed. The ship was now ready for outfitting with supplies and crew, and eventually for deployment to wherever the Venetian government directed it. The entire process, from the initial shaping of the keel to the final launching, could be accomplished in remarkably short timeframes. Under normal circumstances, the Arsenal could complete a warship in approximately 3 months. Under urgent circumstances, with additional workers and resources devoted to a single ship, the Arsenal could complete a warship in as little as 1 month. There are historical accounts suggesting that the Arsenal could produce a complete warship in a single day, though historians still debate whether this represents actual routine capability or exceptional achievement under extraordinary circumstances. The speed of production reflected the Arsenal's systematic approach. Every phase of construction had been analysed and optimised. Workers performed their assigned tasks according to established procedures. Materials arrived in the correct quantities at the correct times. Supervisors coordinated the work to ensure that different sections proceeded in proper sequence. The result was a production system that achieved efficiency levels that would not be matched by other shipbuilders for centuries. The Arsenal did not remain static. The facility that emerged in the 12th century continued to evolve throughout the medieval and early modern periods. Each generation of managers and workers identified inefficiencies and developed improvements. These incremental innovations accumulated over time, creating a production system that became increasingly sophisticated and productive. One significant innovation involved the development of prefabricated components. Rather than shaping every piece of timber individually during assembly, the Arsenal began producing standardized components in advance. Carpenters shaped ribs, frames, and other structural elements according to specifications and stored them until needed. When a ship entered the assembly phase, workers could select pre-shaped components rather than shaping them on site. This reduced construction time considerably. It also ensured greater consistency, since components produced under controlled conditions in specialized workshops met standards more reliably than components shaped during the rushed assembly process. The development of detailed technical drawings represented another crucial innovation. Early shipbuilders relied primarily on oral tradition and personal experience to transmit knowledge. A master craftsman knew how to build a ship because he had learned from another master craftsman through years of apprenticeship. The Arsenal, by contrast, developed written and visual specifications for ships. These drawings showed the ship's dimensions, the shapes of key components, and the relationships between different parts. Workers could reference these drawings to understand exactly what they needed to produce. The drawings also created a permanent record of design knowledge that did not depend on any individual craftsman's memory or skill. The Arsenal experimented continuously with hull designs and construction techniques. Shipbuilders tested different shapes and proportions to improve speed, cargo capacity, and seaworthiness. They tried different wood types and fastening methods to improve durability. They developed specialized ship designs for different purposes: warships optimized for speed and maneuverability, merchant ships optimized for cargo capacity, galleys designed for Mediterranean conditions. This experimentation reflected a systematic approach to improving performance. The Arsenal did not simply build ships according to tradition, it actively sought to improve its products through deliberate testing and refinement. The development of the galley represented one of the Arsenal's most significant innovations. The galley was a long, narrow ship powered primarily by oars, with sails as supplementary propulsion. The design proved particularly effective for Mediterranean conditions, where wind patterns were unpredictable, and coastal waters often required maneuverability that sailing ships could not achieve. The arsenal refined the galley design over centuries, creating increasingly effective versions. By the 15th century, the arsenal was producing galleys that combined speed, maneuverability, and cargo capacity in ways that made them formidable military and commercial vessels. The arsenal also innovated in the materials and techniques used for construction. Shipbuilders experimented with different fastening methods, discovering that certain techniques produce stronger, more durable joints than others. They developed improved caulking materials and techniques that created more effective watertight seals. They experimented with different wood treatments to improve durability and resistance to rot. They developed improved tools and equipment that made the work faster and more precise. These innovations accumulated gradually, but collectively they transformed the arsenal's capabilities. The development of assembly line principles represented perhaps the arsenal's most significant conceptual innovation. While the arsenal did not use the term assembly line, the facility organized production in ways that anticipated the assembly line systems that would emerge centuries later during the Industrial Revolution. Work proceeded in a logical sequence. Components moved from one station to the next. Each worker, or group of workers, performed a specific task, then passed their work to the next station. This sequential organization allowed the facility to maintain continuous production and to achieve remarkable efficiency. The arsenal also developed early forms of quality control. Supervisors inspected work at various stages of production to ensure that it met established standards. If a component did not meet specifications, it was rejected and the worker had to correct it or produce a replacement. This inspection system ensured that defective components did not proceed to later stages of production, where they would waste additional labor and materials. The inspection system also created accountability. Workers knew that their work would be evaluated against objective standards. This incentivized them to perform their tasks competently. The arsenal maintained detailed records of production metrics. Managers tracked how many ships were completed each month. They recorded how many workers were employed in each section. They tracked material consumption and waste. They calculated productivity measures, how much work was accomplished per worker, how much material was required per ship, how long each phase of production required. These metrics allowed managers to identify trends and inefficiencies. If productivity declined, managers could investigate the cause. If one section was consistently slower than others, managers could analyze why and implement improvements. The arsenal also developed early forms of inventory management. The facility maintained stockpiles of materials and components at various stages of completion. Managers tracked these inventories carefully. They ensured that adequate supplies of materials were available to support production without excessive waste or spoilage. They coordinated the production of different components so that they would be available when needed for assembly. This inventory management prevented bottlenecks, where one section had to wait for components from another section. It also prevented excessive accumulation of materials that might deteriorate or require storage space. The arsenal's approach to tool development reflected its commitment to continuous improvement. The facility did not simply use tools that craftsmen had used for centuries. Instead, arsenal managers worked with tool makers to develop improved tools that made work faster and more precise. They developed specialized tools for specific tasks. They experimented with different materials and designs to create tools that performed better than traditional versions. These tool innovations, while seemingly minor, contributed significantly to the arsenal's productivity. The arsenal also pioneered the use of mechanical power to supplement human labor. The facility developed systems of pulleys and levers that allowed workers to move heavy materials and components more easily. These mechanical systems did not replace human labor, but they made the work less physically demanding and more efficient. Workers could accomplish tasks that would have been impossible relying solely on human strength. The mechanical systems also allowed the work to proceed more quickly, since workers did not need to spend as much time and effort moving materials. The arsenal's approach to worker training and skill development represented another form of innovation. Rather than relying entirely on traditional apprenticeship, the arsenal developed more systematic training procedures. New workers received instruction in the specific procedures they needed to follow. They learned through observation and practice, but they also received explicit instruction about what they needed to accomplish and how to accomplish it. This more systematic approach to training allowed workers to become productive more quickly than traditional apprenticeship would have permitted. The arsenal also experimented with different organizational structures to improve efficiency. Managers tested different ways of organizing workers into teams and sections. They experimented with different supervisory ratios. How many workers should report to each supervisor? They tested different incentive systems to motivate workers to perform well. These organizational experiments reflected a systematic approach to management. The arsenal did not simply organize workers according to tradition. It actively sought to find organizational structures that improved productivity and quality. The arsenal's commitment to innovation extended to its relationship with other maritime industries. The facility maintained connections with rope makers, sail makers, and other suppliers. Arsenal managers worked with these suppliers to improve the quality and consistency of their products. They provided specifications and feedback. They sometimes invested in improving suppliers' facilities and equipment. This collaborative approach to innovation meant that improvements in the arsenal's own operations were complemented by improvements in the products and services it received from suppliers. The arsenal also served as a centre of maritime knowledge and innovation for the entire Mediterranean region. Shipbuilders from other cities visited the arsenal to observe its operations and learn its techniques. Some of these visitors returned to their home cities and attempted to replicate the arsenal's methods. While no other facility achieved the arsenal's level of sophistication during the medieval period, the arsenal's influence gradually spread. Other cities developed shipbuilding facilities that incorporated some of the arsenal's organizational principles and techniques. The arsenal's innovations reflected a fundamental commitment to continuous improvement. The facility did not view production as a static process that had been perfected in the past. Instead, managers and workers constantly sought ways to improve efficiency, quality, and productivity. This commitment to innovation was not driven by abstract ideals, but by practical necessity. Venice's power depended on maintaining naval superiority. The arsenal's innovations allowed Venice to build ships faster and more cheaply than competitors could. This gave Venice a strategic advantage that contributed significantly to its political and commercial success. The innovations developed in the arsenal eventually spread beyond shipbuilding. As other industries in Venice and other cities sought to improve their productivity, they adopted organizational principles and techniques that the arsenal had pioneered. The arsenal's influence on manufacturing practices extended far beyond maritime industries. The systematic organization of labor, the standardization of procedures, the use of prefabricated components, the development of detailed technical specifications, all these innovations eventually became standard practices in industrial manufacturing throughout Europe and beyond. The arsenal's productivity translated directly into military advantage. Venice's competitors understood this reality with perfect clarity. A city that could build warships faster than its rivals possessed a strategic advantage that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The arsenal allowed Venice to maintain naval superiority throughout the medieval and early modern periods, even when facing enemies with larger populations and greater resources. The practical implications of the arsenal's efficiency became apparent during periods of military conflict. When Venice engaged in naval warfare, the city could replace losses quickly. If a fleet suffered damage in battle, the arsenal could repair damaged ships or build replacements within weeks or months. Competitors required years to accomplish the same task. This meant that Venice could sustain prolonged naval conflicts that would exhaust other maritime powers. The arsenal essentially provided Venice with an inexhaustible supply of warships, limited only by the availability of timber and the capacity of the workforce. The speed of ship production also allowed Venice to respond rapidly to emerging threats. If a rival power threatened Venetian interests, the government could order the arsenal to increase production. Within months, additional warships could be deployed to defend Venetian territories or interests. This rapid response capability deterred potential enemies. They understood that attacking Venice would provoke a response that the arsenal could support with continuous reinforcements. This deterrent effect meant that Venice could often achieve its political objectives through the threat of military action rather than through actual warfare. The arsenal's efficiency also influenced Venice's commercial strategy. The city could afford to maintain large merchant fleets because it could replace ships lost to pirates, storms, or accidents relatively quickly. This reliability made Venetian merchants more competitive in international trade. Merchants from other cities faced greater risks because replacing lost ships required more time and resources. Venetian merchants could therefore offer more reliable service and lower prices. This commercial advantage contributed significantly to Venice's wealth and power. The arsenal's productivity influenced the development of naval tactics and strategy throughout the Mediterranean. Commanders understood that Venice could sustain higher casualty rates than other powers because it could replace losses more quickly. This knowledge influenced how other powers approached conflict with Venice. Some chose to avoid direct naval confrontation, knowing that they could not match Venice's capacity to replace losses. Others developed asymmetrical strategies, using galleys or smaller vessels that could avoid direct confrontation with Venetian battle fleets. The arsenal's existence therefore shaped the strategic calculations of every maritime power in the Mediterranean. The arsenal also influenced how other cities approached military procurement. Recognizing the advantage that rapid ship production provided, other maritime powers attempted to develop similar facilities. The Ottoman Empire eventually developed shipbuilding facilities that incorporated some of the arsenal's organizational principles. The Spanish developed shipbuilding facilities that achieved significant productivity. The English developed naval dockyards that eventually rivaled the arsenal in sophistication. Yet during the medieval period and much of the early modern period, no other facility matched the arsenal's combination of speed, quality, and productivity. The arsenal's military significance extended beyond mere numbers. The facility did not simply build ships quickly. It built ships that were reliable, seaworthy, and effective in combat. The standardization and quality control procedures ensured that ships met established performance standards. This meant that Venetian commanders could rely on their ships performing as expected. They did not need to worry that a ship might be poorly constructed or unreliable. This reliability gave Venetian commanders confidence and allowed them to plan operations with greater precision. The arsenal also influenced the development of naval technology. Because the facility was constantly experimenting with new designs and techniques, it served as a laboratory for maritime innovation. Improvements developed in the arsenal were quickly incorporated into production. This meant that Venetian warships incorporated the latest technological improvements more rapidly than competitors' ships did. Over time, this technological advantage accumulated. Venetian ships became known for their superior design, construction quality, and performance characteristics. The arsenal's influence on Venetian military power extended to land warfare as well. Venice used its naval superiority to project power onto land. The city could transport armies to distant locations and supply them through maritime routes. Competitors could not match this capability. The arsenal's productivity meant that Venice could maintain the large merchant fleets necessary to support overseas military campaigns. This amphibious capability gave Venice strategic options that land-based powers did not possess. The arsenal also influenced how Venice conducted diplomacy. The city's naval power, supported by the arsenal's productivity, gave Venice leverage in negotiations with other powers. When Venice threatened military action, other powers understood that Venice possessed the capacity to follow through on those threats. This credibility enhanced Venice's diplomatic effectiveness. The city could often achieve its objectives through negotiation because other powers recognized the futility of resisting Venetian demands backed by superior military force. The arsenal's strategic significance influenced how Venice invested in its military infrastructure. The city maintained the arsenal as a priority, allocating substantial resources to its maintenance and improvement. The government understood that the arsenal was the foundation of Venetian power. Without the arsenal, Venice would have been just another Mediterranean city, dependent on trade and subject to the whims of more powerful neighbours. With the arsenal, Venice became a major power capable of defending its interests and projecting influence throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The arsenal also influenced Venice's territorial acquisitions and holdings. The city used its naval superiority to conquer and hold territories throughout the Mediterranean and the Adriatic. These territories provided Venice with strategic bases, sources of raw materials, and control over important trade routes. The arsenal made these territorial acquisitions possible by providing the naval force necessary to conquer and defend them. Without the arsenal's productivity, Venice could not have maintained control over such a far-flung territorial empire. The arsenal's military significance created vulnerabilities as well. Because Venice depended so heavily on naval power, threats to the arsenal represented threats to Venetian security. If the arsenal were destroyed or significantly damaged, Venice's military capacity would be severely compromised. Enemies understood this reality. During periods of conflict, some of Venice's rivals attempted to attack the arsenal directly. The city therefore invested in defending the arsenal, maintaining guards and fortifications to protect the facility from attack. The arsenal's strategic importance meant that it became a target for anyone seeking to strike at Venice's power. The arsenal's influence on Venetian military strategy extended to the types of ships it produced. The facility specialized in building galleys, the dominant warship design in the Mediterranean during much of the medieval period. Galleys were long, narrow ships, powered primarily by oars, with sails as supplementary propulsion. They were fast, maneuverable, and effective in the relatively calm waters of the Mediterranean. The arsenal's ability to produce galleys quickly and in large numbers meant that Venice could maintain galley fleets that dominated Mediterranean naval warfare for centuries. The arsenal's productivity also influenced how Venice approached naval recruitment and training. Because the city could build ships quickly, it could expand its navy rapidly when necessary. This meant that Venice needed to recruit and train sailors and marines to crew the new ships. The city developed systems for recruiting and training naval personnel that paralleled the arsenal's organizational efficiency. Young men could be trained as sailors or marines relatively quickly. They could be organized into crews that operated the ships the arsenal produced. This combination of rapid ship production and rapid personnel recruitment meant that Venice could expand its military capacity quickly when circumstances required. The arsenal's strategic importance influenced how Venice approached international relations. The city cultivated relationships with powers that could provide timber and other raw materials necessary for ship production. It maintained trade routes that brought these materials to Venice. It protected these supply lines militarily when necessary. The arsenal's dependence on external supplies of timber meant that Venice's security depended partly on maintaining access to these supplies. This influenced Venice's foreign policy and military strategy throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The arsenal also influenced how Venice approached technological development in other domains. The organizational principles and techniques developed in the arsenal influenced how other Venetian industries approached production. The city's military technology benefited from innovations developed in the arsenal. The arsenal's success demonstrated that systematic organization, standardization, and continuous improvement could produce remarkable results. These lessons influenced how Venice approached other challenges and opportunities. The arsenal's military significance eventually declined as naval technology evolved. The development of ocean-going sailing ships, the emergence of gunpowder naval warfare, and the shift of commercial routes away from the Mediterranean gradually reduced the arsenal's strategic importance. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the arsenal was no longer the dominant force it had been during the medieval and early modern periods. Yet for nearly 5 centuries, the arsenal was the foundation of Venetian power. It allowed a small city with limited resources to dominate the Mediterranean and maintain an empire that extended across vast distances. This achievement remains one of the most remarkable examples of how organizational innovation and systematic production can translate into strategic advantage. The arsenal's success did not remain confined to Venice. The organizational principles and production techniques developed in the facility gradually influenced how other societies approach manufacturing. This diffusion of knowledge occurred through multiple channels: merchants who observed the arsenal's operations, shipbuilders who traveled to Venice to study its methods, military officials who recognized the strategic advantages the arsenal provided, and written accounts that described the facility's organization and achievements. The Ottoman Empire represented one of the first non-Venetian powers to develop shipbuilding facilities that incorporated some of the arsenal's principles. Ottoman shipyards, particularly those in Constantinople and other major ports, adopted organizational structures that resembled the arsenal's layout. They divided labor into specialized tasks. They standardized production procedures. They maintained permanent workforces. While Ottoman shipyards never achieved the arsenal's level of sophistication, they demonstrated that the organizational model could be adapted to different cultural and political contexts. The Ottomans understood that rapid ship production provided strategic advantages, and they invested in developing shipbuilding facilities that could deliver those advantages. The Spanish Empire also developed shipbuilding facilities that incorporated elements of the arsenal's organizational approach. Spanish shipyards, particularly those in Seville and other major ports, adopted systematic production procedures and specialized labor organization. The Spanish focus on building ocean-going sailing ships rather than Mediterranean galleys meant that their shipyards developed somewhat different designs and techniques than the arsenal. However, the underlying organizational principles, standardization, specialization, systematic management, reflected the arsenal's influence. Spanish shipbuilders who had studied in Venice or learned from Venetian techniques brought this knowledge to Spanish shipyards. The English developed naval dockyards that eventually rivaled the arsenal in sophistication. Portsmouth and other English naval yards adopted organizational structures and production techniques that reflected the arsenal's model. English shipbuilders recognized that systematic organization and standardization could improve productivity and quality. They invested in developing facilities that could build ships efficiently and reliably. By the 16th and 17th centuries, English naval yards were producing warships that competed effectively with Venetian and Spanish vessels. The arsenal's influence on English shipbuilding contributed to England's eventual emergence as a major naval power. The French also developed shipbuilding facilities that incorporated some of the arsenal's organizational principles. French naval yards adopted systematic production procedures and specialized labor organization. French shipbuilders studied Venetian techniques and adapted them to French circumstances. The French focus on building large sailing warships meant that their shipyards developed different designs than the arsenal, but the underlying organizational approach reflected Venetian influence. French shipbuilding eventually became competitive with other European powers, partly because French yards had adopted organizational principles pioneered by the arsenal. The influence of the arsenal extended beyond Europe. When European powers established colonies and trading posts in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they often developed shipbuilding facilities in these locations. These facilities frequently incorporated organizational principles that trace back to the arsenal. Colonial shipyards adopted standardized production procedures, specialized labor organization, and systematic management practices. This meant that the arsenal's influence spread globally as European colonial powers expanded their reach. The arsenal's influence on manufacturing extended beyond shipbuilding. Other industries in Venice and other European cities adopted organizational principles that the Arsenal had pioneered. Textile manufacturers developed factories that divided labor into specialized tasks and standardized production procedures. Metalworking facilities adopted similar organizational structures. Printing shops organized their labor along lines that resembled the Arsenal's model. Over time, these organizational principles became standard practices in European manufacturing. The Arsenal's influence gradually transformed how goods were produced throughout Europe. The development of the factory system during the Industrial Revolution reflected principles that the Arsenal had pioneered centuries earlier. Early factory owners organized labor into specialized tasks performed by workers in dedicated spaces. They standardized production procedures. They maintained hierarchical management structures. They kept detailed records of production metrics. They continuously sought to improve efficiency and productivity. These practices had emerged in the Arsenal during the medieval period. The Industrial Revolution did not invent these practices. Rather, it applied them on an unprecedented scale, using new technologies like steam power and mechanized equipment. The Arsenal's influence on labor organization also extended to the Industrial Revolution. The relationship between workers and employers that developed in the Arsenal, workers selling their labor for wages, working according to procedures established by management, lacking ownership of their products, became standard in industrial manufacturing. The Arsenalotti pioneered this relationship centuries before the industrial working class emerged. Their experience demonstrated that large numbers of workers could be organized to perform specialized labor under centralized management. This model eventually became the foundation of industrial labor organization. The Arsenal also influenced how later societies approached military procurement and production. The principle that governments could own and operate production facilities to manufacture military equipment reflected the Arsenal's model. Many nations eventually developed government-owned arsenals, shipyards, and weapons factories based on the Venetian model. These facilities adopted the organizational principles that the Arsenal had pioneered. They divided labor into specialized tasks. They standardized production procedures. They maintained permanent workforces. They kept detailed records. They continuously sought to improve efficiency. The Arsenal's influence on standardization extended far beyond shipbuilding. The principle that products could be manufactured to consistent specifications, that components from different production runs could be interchangeable, that quality could be controlled through systematic procedures. These principles emerged in the Arsenal and gradually spread throughout manufacturing. By the 19th century, standardization had become a fundamental principle of industrial manufacturing. Interchangeable parts, standardized dimensions, and quality control procedures became standard practices. These practices traced back to innovations that the Arsenal had pioneered centuries earlier. The Arsenal's influence on technical documentation also extended beyond shipbuilding. The practice of creating detailed written and visual specifications for manufactured products reflected the Arsenal's approach. The Arsenal had developed detailed drawings and specifications that allowed workers to understand exactly what they needed to produce. This practice eventually became standard in manufacturing. Technical drawings, blueprints, and specifications became essential tools for coordinating production. The principle that knowledge could be recorded in written and visual form and communicated to workers reflected the Arsenal's pioneering approach. The Arsenal's influence on management and organizational theory extended into the modern era. Historians and management theorists have recognized the Arsenal as a precursor to modern manufacturing and management practices. The facility demonstrated principles that would later be formalized in management theory: division of labor, specialization, standardization, systematic management, continuous improvement. These principles, which emerged in the Arsenal through practical necessity, eventually became the foundation of modern management science. The Arsenal's experience provided historical evidence that these principles could work effectively in practice. The arsenal's influence on technological innovation also extended beyond shipbuilding. The facility demonstrated that systematic organization and continuous experimentation could produce technological improvements. The arsenal did not simply build ships according to tradition. It actively sought to improve designs, techniques, and procedures. This commitment to continuous improvement reflected an approach to technology that would eventually become standard in modern manufacturing. The principle that products and processes could be continuously improved through systematic experimentation and refinement emerged in the arsenal and gradually spread throughout manufacturing. The arsenal's influence on supply chain management also extended beyond shipbuilding. The facility developed procedures for coordinating the production and delivery of materials and components from multiple suppliers. It maintained inventories of materials at various stages of completion. It coordinated the timing of different production activities to ensure that materials arrived when needed. These supply chain management practices reflected an approach to production that would eventually become standard in modern manufacturing. The principle that production could be coordinated across multiple suppliers and production stages reflected the arsenal's pioneering approach. The arsenal's influence on worker training and skill development also extended beyond shipbuilding. The facility developed systematic procedures for training workers in specific tasks. It recognized that workers could become productive relatively quickly if they received proper instruction in standardized procedures. This approach to worker training reflected principles that would eventually become standard in industrial manufacturing. The principle that workers could be trained efficiently through systematic instruction in standardized procedures emerged in the arsenal and gradually spread throughout manufacturing. The arsenal's influence on productivity measurement and analysis also extended beyond shipbuilding. The facility maintained detailed records of production metrics: how many ships were completed, how many workers were employed, how much material was used. These records allowed managers to analyze productivity and identify inefficiencies. This approach to measuring and analyzing productivity reflected principles that would eventually become standard in manufacturing management. The principle that production could be measured, analyzed, and continuously improved through systematic measurement reflected the arsenal's pioneering approach. The arsenal's historical significance extends far beyond its role in Venetian military and commercial success. The facility represented a fundamental innovation in how human labor could be organized and how complex products could be manufactured. The organizational principles and production techniques that emerged in the arsenal eventually spread throughout the world. They became the foundation of industrial manufacturing. They influenced how governments approached military procurement. They shaped how workers and employers related to each other. The arsenal's influence on human civilization extended far beyond the medieval Mediterranean. The facility pioneered approaches to production that would eventually transform how goods are manufactured throughout the modern world. The arsenal's dominance gradually diminished as maritime technology and global trade patterns evolved. The facility, that had been the foundation of Venetian power for nearly 5 centuries, encountered challenges it could not overcome. These challenges emerged not from internal failures, but from external transformations that altered the conditions under which the arsenal operated. The development of ocean-going sailing ships represented the first major challenge to the arsenal's strategic significance. For centuries, the galley had dominated Mediterranean naval warfare. The arsenal's expertise lay in building galleys quickly and efficiently. However, as European powers began exploring and trading with distant continents, they required ships capable of crossing oceans. Ocean-going sailing ships needed different designs than galleys. They required larger hulls, different rigging systems, and different construction techniques. The arsenal attempted to adapt to these new requirements, but other shipbuilding centres developed greater expertise in constructing ocean-going vessels. The shift of major trade routes away from the Mediterranean further reduced the arsenal's strategic importance. For centuries, Venice's wealth and power had depended on controlling Mediterranean trade routes. The discovery of sea routes to Asia around Africa and the opening of trade routes to the Americas shifted the focus of European commerce away from the Mediterranean. Cities with access to the Atlantic Ocean, Lisbon, Seville, London, became more important commercial centres than Venice. The arsenal's productivity could not compensate for Venice's loss of geographic advantage. The city's commercial importance declined, and with it, the demand for the ships the arsenal produced. The emergence of gunpowder naval warfare also challenged the arsenal's traditional designs and expertise. Medieval galleys relied primarily on ramming and boarding tactics. Gunpowder cannons changed naval warfare fundamentally. Warships needed to be designed to carry heavy cannons and withstand cannon fire. They needed different hull shapes, different internal structures, and different rigging systems than traditional galleys. The arsenal adapted to these changes, but other shipbuilding centres developed greater expertise in designing and building cannon-armed sailing ships. The arsenal's traditional strengths became less relevant as naval warfare evolved. The rise of national navies also transformed the arsenal's role. During the medieval period, Venice's navy had been the dominant maritime force in the Mediterranean. However, as nation-states consolidated power and invested in military forces, national navies became larger and more powerful than any city-state could maintain. Spain, England, France, and other major powers developed naval forces that eventually surpassed Venice's fleet. The arsenal could not produce ships fast enough to maintain Venice's naval superiority against these larger national powers. The arsenal's workforce also faced challenges during this period. The Arsenalotti, who had formed a cohesive and relatively stable workforce for centuries, began to experience disruptions. As Venice's commercial importance declined, the demand for ships decreased. The arsenal could not maintain its full workforce during periods of reduced demand. Workers faced unemployment or underemployment. The sense of security and stability that the Arsenalotti had enjoyed began to erode. The collective identity that had characterized the Arsenalotti weakened as economic conditions deteriorated. The arsenal's physical facilities also required increasing maintenance and investment. The buildings, equipment, and infrastructure that had served the facility well for centuries gradually deteriorated. Maintaining and repairing these facilities required substantial resources. As Venice's wealth declined, the government reduced its investment in the arsenal's maintenance. The facility's condition gradually deteriorated. Equipment became outdated. Buildings required repairs that were not always completed promptly. The arsenal's productivity declined as its physical infrastructure deteriorated. The arsenal also faced competition from other shipbuilding centres that had adopted and improved upon its organisational principles. English shipyards, French shipyards, and Dutch shipyards developed production capabilities that rivaled or exceeded the arsenal's. These competing shipyards incorporated the organisational principles that the arsenal had pioneered, but adapted them to new ship designs and production requirements. They invested in modern equipment and facilities. They recruited skilled workers and managers. They competed effectively with the arsenal for contracts and customers. The arsenal's response to these challenges involved attempts at modernisation and adaptation. The facility invested in new equipment and techniques. It experimented with new ship designs. It attempted to recruit and train workers for new types of production. However, these efforts could not fully compensate for the fundamental changes occurring in maritime technology and global trade patterns. The arsenal remained a significant shipbuilding facility, but it no longer dominated Mediterranean shipbuilding as it had during the medieval period. The Napoleonic Wars represented a final blow to the arsenal's significance. When Napoleon conquered Venice in 1797, he recognized the arsenal's strategic importance and attempted to incorporate it into French military production. However, the arsenal's facilities and organization, which had been designed for galley production, did not adapt easily to French military requirements. The French eventually abandoned the arsenal as a major production facility. After the Napoleonic Wars, Venice came under Austrian control. The Austrians maintained the arsenal, but primarily for maintenance and repair of existing ships, rather than for large-scale new construction. The arsenal's decline as a production facility did not mean the end of its historical significance. The facility continued to operate throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, though in a diminished capacity. It served as a naval yard for maintenance and repair. It produced some new ships, though in much smaller numbers than during its peak. The arsenal eventually became primarily a museum and historical site, preserving the memory of its former glory. Today, the Venetian arsenal is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, valued for its historical significance and architectural heritage. The arsenal's transformation from a dominant production facility to a historical monument reflected broader changes in how manufacturing and military power were organized. The Industrial Revolution had transformed manufacturing throughout Europe. Factory systems using steam power and mechanized equipment had replaced traditional craft production and early industrial organization. The arsenal's organizational principles had influenced the development of these factory systems, but the arsenal itself could not easily adapt to the new industrial technologies. The facility remained organized according to principles developed during the medieval period. It could not easily incorporate steam power, mechanized equipment, and other innovations that characterized industrial manufacturing. The arsenal's decline also reflected the broader decline of Venice as a major power. The city that had dominated Mediterranean trade and politics for centuries gradually lost its prominence. Other powers, the Ottoman Empire, Spain, England, France, became more powerful and influential. Venice's geographic advantages, which had been so important during the medieval period, became less relevant as global trade patterns shifted. The arsenal, which had been the foundation of Venetian power, could not prevent or reverse this broader decline. Yet the arsenal's historical legacy extended far beyond its period of active dominance. The organizational principles and production techniques that had emerged in the arsenal influenced manufacturing throughout Europe and eventually throughout the world. The facility had demonstrated that large-scale production of complex products was possible through systematic organization of labor, standardization of procedures, and continuous improvement. These principles eventually became the foundation of industrial manufacturing. The arsenal's influence on how goods are produced extended far beyond shipbuilding or even maritime industries. The arsenal also left a legacy in how societies approached military production and procurement. The principle that governments could own and operate production facilities to manufacture military equipment reflected the arsenal's model. Many nations eventually developed government-owned arsenals, shipyards, and weapons factories based on the Venetian model. These facilities adopted organizational principles that the arsenal had pioneered. The arsenal demonstrated that systematic organization could produce military equipment efficiently and reliably. This lesson influenced military procurement practices throughout the world. The arsenal's decline also illustrated important lessons about technological change and organizational adaptation. The facility that had been at the forefront of production technology during the medieval period found it difficult to adapt to new technologies and new market conditions. The organizational principles that had made the arsenal successful during one historical period became less relevant as conditions changed. This pattern, where successful organizations struggle to adapt to changing circumstances, has repeated throughout history. The arsenal's experience provided an early example of how technological change and market evolution can render even the most successful organizations vulnerable. The arsenal's transformation from a production facility to a historical monument also reflected changing attitudes toward history and heritage. As industrial manufacturing developed and spread, earlier forms of production became historical curiosities rather than active economic centers. The arsenal, which had once been at the cutting edge of production technology, became a relic of a past era. Yet this transformation also preserved the arsenal's physical structures and allowed future generations to study and learn from its organisation and achievements. The arsenal's buildings, tools, and records provided tangible evidence of how medieval and early modern societies had organised production. The arsenal's historical significance ultimately transcends its period of active dominance. The facility represented a crucial innovation in how human labour could be organised and how complex products could be manufactured. The organisational principles and production techniques that emerged in the arsenal influenced manufacturing throughout the world. The facility demonstrated that systematic organisation, standardization, and continuous improvement could produce remarkable results. These lessons, learned in the medieval arsenal, eventually transformed how goods are produced throughout the modern world. The arsenal's decline as an active production facility did not diminish its historical importance. Rather, it allowed the facility to become a symbol of how innovation and systematic organisation can transform human capabilities. The arsenal's history offers profound insights into how societies organise production and respond to challenges requiring systematic solutions. These lessons extend far beyond shipbuilding or medieval history. They illuminate fundamental principles about human organisation, technological development, and the relationship between innovation and power. The first lesson concerns the power of systematic organisation. The arsenal succeeded not because individual workers possessed extraordinary skill or because Venice possessed unique resources. Rather, the facility succeeded because it organised labour systematically. Work was divided into specialised tasks. Each task was performed by workers trained in that specific function. Procedures were standardized so that workers could perform their tasks reliably and predictably. This systematic approach allowed the arsenal to achieve productivity levels that traditional craft production could not match. The lesson extends to any context where complex work must be accomplished at scale. Systematic organisation of labour, standardization of procedures, and clear division of responsibilities enable organisations to accomplish remarkable things. The second lesson concerns the importance of standardization. The arsenal standardized not only the dimensions of components, but also the procedures workers followed. Standardization allowed components produced at different times to fit together reliably. It allowed workers to become productive quickly because they did not need to adapt their work to unique circumstances. It allowed quality to be controlled because supervisors could evaluate whether products met established standards. Standardization reduced the role of individual judgment and created predictability. This principle extends to any manufacturing or service context. Standardization enables organizations to scale production, maintain quality, and train workers efficiently. The third lesson concerns the relationship between specialization and productivity. The arsenal achieved high productivity partly by having workers specialize in specific tasks. A worker who performed the same task repeatedly became expert in that task. They worked faster and more accurately than a generalist who performed many different tasks. Specialization also allowed the arsenal to match workers' skills to task requirements. Highly skilled workers focused on tasks requiring expertise. Less skilled workers handled routine tasks. This matching of skills to task requirements improved overall productivity. The principle extends to any organizational context. Specialization allows individuals to develop expertise and allows organizations to match capabilities to requirements. The fourth lesson concerns the importance of management and coordination. The arsenal succeeded not only because individual workers performed their tasks well, but because management coordinated the work of thousands of workers across multiple specialized sections. Supervisors ensured that workers followed procedures. They coordinated the flow of materials and components between sections. They maintained records of production and identified inefficiencies. Management created the systems and structures that allowed individual effort to be coordinated toward collective goals. This principle extends to any large organization. Effective management and coordination are essential for translating individual effort into collective achievement. The fifth lesson concerns the relationship between innovation and necessity. The Arsenal emerged because Venice faced a crisis, the need to build many ships quickly. This necessity drove innovation. The city could not rely on traditional craft production. It had to develop new approaches to organizing labor and production. The innovations that emerged from this necessity, standardization, specialization, systematic management, eventually transformed manufacturing throughout the world. The principle extends broadly. Necessity often drives innovation. When faced with challenges that existing approaches cannot solve, organizations often develop new approaches that eventually prove more effective than traditional methods. The sixth lesson concerns the importance of continuous improvement. The Arsenal did not remain static. Each generation of managers and workers identified inefficiencies and developed improvements. These incremental innovations accumulated over time, creating increasingly sophisticated production systems. The facility demonstrated that continuous improvement, pursued systematically over long periods, can produce remarkable results. This principle extends to any organization seeking to improve performance. Small improvements, accumulated over time, can transform organizational capabilities. The seventh lesson concerns the relationship between production and power. The Arsenal demonstrated that the capacity to produce goods at scale translates into political and military power. Venice's naval dominance depended fundamentally on the Arsenal's ability to build ships faster than competitors could. This naval dominance allowed Venice to protect its trade routes, defend its territories, and project power throughout the Mediterranean. The principle extends to any context where production capacity influences power. Nations that can produce military equipment, food, or other essential goods more efficiently than competitors gain strategic advantages. Production capacity is a form of power. The eighth lesson concerns the importance of knowledge and expertise. The Arsenal succeeded partly because it accumulated knowledge about shipbuilding, production organization, and management. This knowledge was recorded in written and visual form, allowing it to be preserved and transmitted to new generations of workers. The principle extends broadly. Organizations that systematically capture and preserve knowledge perform better than organizations that rely on individual memory and experience. Knowledge management, capturing, organizing, and transmitting knowledge is essential for organizational success. The ninth lesson concerns the relationship between workers and employers. The Arsenal pioneered a new relationship between workers and employers, workers selling their labor for wages, working according to procedures established by management, lacking ownership of their products. This relationship eventually became standard in industrial manufacturing. The Arsenalotti demonstrated that large numbers of workers could be organized to perform specialized labor under centralized management. They also demonstrated that workers could organize collectively to protect their interests. The principle extends to any context involving employment relationships. How workers and employers relate to each other influences both productivity and social stability. The 10th lesson concerns the importance of physical infrastructure and facilities. The Arsenal succeeded partly because it invested in specialized facilities designed for specific production tasks. The timber yards, soaring sections, hull construction buildings, and other specialized facilities allowed work to proceed efficiently. The physical layout reflected careful planning about workflow and efficiency. The principle extends to any production context. Appropriate facilities and infrastructure enable organizations to operate efficiently. Poor facilities and infrastructure constrain performance. The 11th lesson concerns the relationship between technology and organization. The Arsenal's success did not depend primarily on advanced technology. Medieval technology was relatively simple. Hand tools, basic mechanical devices, simple materials. Rather, The arsenal's success depended on how this technology was organized and deployed. Workers used simple tools systematically according to established procedures. The principle extends broadly. How technology is organized and deployed matters as much as the technology itself. Advanced technology deployed haphazardly may produce poor results. Simple technology deployed systematically may produce excellent results. The 12th lesson concerns the importance of measurement and analysis. The arsenal maintained detailed records of production metrics. Managers tracked how many ships were completed, how many workers were employed, how much material was used. These records allowed managers to analyze productivity and identify inefficiencies. The principle extends to any organization seeking to improve performance. Measurement and analysis enable organizations to understand their operations and identify opportunities for improvement. Organizations that do not measure and analyze their operations cannot improve systematically. The 13th lesson concerns the relationship between scale and complexity. The arsenal demonstrated that large-scale production of complex products is possible through systematic organization. However, this requires careful planning and management. As organizations grow larger and more complex, the importance of systematic organization increases. The principle extends to any large organization. As organizations grow, they must develop increasingly sophisticated systems for coordination and management. Organizations that fail to develop such systems often experience declining performance as they grow. The 14th lesson concerns the importance of adaptability and change. The arsenal eventually declined partly because it could not adapt to changing circumstances. The organizational principles and production techniques that had made the arsenal successful during one historical period became less relevant as maritime technology and global trade patterns changed. The principle extends broadly. Organizations that cannot adapt to changing circumstances eventually decline. Adaptability and willingness to change are essential for long-term organizational success. The 15th lesson concerns the relationship between efficiency and human dignity. The arsenal achieved high productivity through systematic organization of labor. However, this organization also meant that workers had limited control over their work and limited autonomy in their jobs. Workers performed repetitive tasks according to procedures established by management. The principle extends to any production system. Efficiency and worker autonomy often exist in tension. Systems optimized for efficiency may limit worker autonomy. Systems that maximize worker autonomy may sacrifice efficiency. Balancing these competing values remains an ongoing challenge in modern organizations. These lessons from the arsenal extend far beyond medieval shipbuilding. They illuminate fundamental principles about how human societies organize production, develop technology, and exercise power. The arsenal demonstrated that systematic organization, standardization, and continuous improvement can produce remarkable results. These principles, learned in the medieval arsenal, eventually transformed manufacturing throughout the world. Understanding the arsenal's history provides insights into how modern organizations function and how they might improve their performance. The arsenal's experience suggests that many of the principles that characterize successful modern organizations, systematic organization, standardization, specialization, continuous improvement, measurement and analysis, are not new. Rather, they emerged centuries ago in response to practical challenges. The arsenal's history demonstrates that these principles have proven effective across centuries and contexts. The arsenal occupies a unique position in the history of human civilization. It existed at a crucial moment when medieval society was beginning to transform into early modern society. It embodied principles that belonged to neither period entirely, but served as a bridge between them. Understanding the arsenal's historical significance requires examining how it connected the medieval world to the modern world that would eventually emerge. The medieval world operated primarily according to principles of craft production and feudal organization. Goods were produced by skilled craftsmen who controlled their work and maintained knowledge through apprenticeship systems. Production occurred at small scale, with individual craftsmen or small workshops producing goods for local markets. Labor organization reflected feudal relationships, masters, journeymen, apprentices, with clear hierarchies and limited mobility between ranks. Knowledge was transmitted orally and through practice rather than through written documentation. Quality and production rates varied considerably depending on individual craftsmen's skill and efforts. The modern industrial world operates according to very different principles. Goods are produced in factories by workers performing specialized tasks according to standardized procedures. Production occurs at enormous scale, with factories producing goods for regional, national, and global markets. Labor organization reflects employment relationships rather than feudal hierarchies, with workers selling their labor for wages. Knowledge is recorded in written and visual form and transmitted through formal training systems. Quality and production rates are controlled through systematic procedures and management oversight. The arsenal represented a transitional form of production organization that incorporated elements of both the medieval and modern worlds. Like medieval craft production, the arsenal relied on skilled craftsmen and traditional hand tools. Master craftsmen possessed expertise and made critical decisions about quality and design. Apprenticeship remained an important mechanism for transmitting knowledge. Yet the arsenal also incorporated elements that anticipated industrial production. Labor was specialized and standardized. Production occurred at large scale. Knowledge was recorded in written form. Quality was controlled through systematic procedures. Management coordinated the work of thousands of workers. This transitional character made the arsenal historically significant in ways that extended beyond its immediate context. The facility demonstrated that production could be organized differently than medieval craft production organized it. It showed that large-scale production of complex products was possible without relying on slave labor or feudal obligation. It proved that systematic organization, standardization, and continuous improvement could produce remarkable results. These demonstrations influenced how other societies approached production. The arsenal provided a model that other societies could study and adapt. The arsenal's influence on the development of industrial manufacturing reflected this transitional character. Early industrial manufacturers faced the challenge of organizing production at scales that traditional craft production could not achieve. They studied the arsenal's organization and adapted its principles to their circumstances. They standardized production procedures. They specialized labor. They maintained hierarchical management structures. They kept detailed records. They continuously sought to improve efficiency. As industrial manufacturing developed and spread, these principles became increasingly sophisticated and formalized. Yet they traced back to innovations that the arsenal had pioneered centuries earlier. The arsenal also represented a transitional form of labor organization. The Arsenalotti occupied a position between medieval craftsmen and industrial workers. Like medieval craftsmen, they possessed skill and expertise. Like industrial workers, they sold their labor for wages and worked according to procedures established by management. The Arsenalotti demonstrated that workers could be organized to perform specialized labor under centralized management. They also demonstrated that workers could organize collectively to protect their interests. This transitional form of labor organization influenced how labor would be organized in industrial manufacturing. The arsenal's relationship to technological development also reflected its transitional character. The facility did not rely on advanced technology. Medieval technology was relatively simple, yet the arsenal deployed this simple technology systematically and continuously sought to improve it. This approach to technology, using available technology systematically and seeking continuous improvement, anticipated how industrial manufacturing would approach technology. Industrial manufacturers would eventually develop more advanced technology, but they would apply the same principles of systematic deployment and continuous improvement that the arsenal had pioneered. The arsenal's influence on how societies approached military production and procurement reflected its transitional character. The facility demonstrated that governments could own and operate production facilities to manufacture military equipment. This principle eventually became standard practice. Governments throughout the world developed government-owned arsenals, shipyards, and weapons factories. These facilities adopted organizational principles that the arsenal had pioneered. Yet the arsenal also existed in a transitional moment. It emerged before modern nation-states had fully consolidated power and before governments routinely owned and operated production facilities. The arsenal was an early example of state-owned production, but it was not unique or revolutionary in its time. It became historically significant partly because it anticipated patterns that would become standard in later periods. The arsenal's physical location in Venice also reflected its transitional historical significance. Venice itself occupied a transitional position in medieval and early modern history. The city was neither a feudal kingdom nor a modern nation-state. It was a merchant republic that combined elements of both political forms. Venice's government was controlled by merchant families who understood commerce and production in ways that feudal lords did not. This merchant perspective influenced how Venice approached the arsenal. The city viewed the arsenal not as a feudal obligation, but as an investment that would produce returns. This commercial perspective on production influenced how the arsenal was organized and managed. The arsenal's emergence during a period of military crisis also reflected its transitional historical significance. The facility emerged because Venice faced an urgent military challenge that traditional production methods could not address. This crisis forced innovation. The innovations that emerged from this crisis, standardization, specialization, systematic management, eventually transformed manufacturing throughout the world. Yet the arsenal's emergence through crisis also reflected medieval patterns. Medieval societies often innovated in response to immediate challenges rather than through abstract planning. The arsenal emerged not because Venice had developed a comprehensive theory of production organization, but because the city faced an urgent practical problem that required a practical solution. The arsenal's decline reflected the broader transition from medieval to modern society. As industrial manufacturing developed and spread, the arsenal's organizational principles became less distinctive. Other facilities adopted and improved upon these principles. The arsenal's focus on galley production became less relevant as ocean-going sailing ships became more important. The arsenal's location in the Mediterranean became less advantageous as global trade shifted away from the Mediterranean. The arsenal declined not because it failed, but because the world changed around it. The facility that had been at the forefront of production technology during one historical period found itself increasingly peripheral as new technologies and new organizational forms emerged. Yet the arsenal's historical significance persisted even as its practical importance declined. The facility had demonstrated principles that would prove fundamental to industrial manufacturing. It had shown that systematic organization could produce remarkable results. It had proved that large-scale production of complex products was possible. It had illustrated how knowledge could be recorded and transmitted systematically. These demonstrations influenced manufacturing throughout the world. The arsenal's legacy extended far beyond its period of active dominance. The arsenal also represented a crucial moment in the relationship between technology and society. The facility demonstrated that technological capability alone does not determine outcomes. The arsenal did not possess technology that was dramatically superior to what other shipbuilders possessed. Rather, the arsenal's advantage derived from how it organized labor and deployed technology systematically. This principle that how technology is organized and deployed matters as much as the technology itself, extended far beyond shipbuilding. It influenced how societies approach technology development and deployment in many contexts. The arsenal's historical significance also reflected its role in demonstrating the possibilities of systematic organization. Medieval society operated largely according to tradition and personal relationships. The arsenal demonstrated that production could be organized systematically according to rational principles. This demonstration influenced how other societies approached organization. Governments, businesses, and other institutions gradually adopted more systematic approaches to organization. The arsenal provided historical evidence that systematic organization could work effectively in practice. The arsenal's position as a bridge between medieval and modern worlds also reflected its role in demonstrating the power of innovation driven by practical necessity. The facility emerged because Venice faced a practical problem that required a practical solution. The innovations that emerged from this necessity eventually transformed manufacturing throughout the world. This pattern, where practical necessity drives innovation that eventually transforms entire industries or societies, has repeated throughout history. The arsenal provided an early and particularly clear example of this pattern. The arsenal's historical significance ultimately transcends its specific context. The facility represented a crucial innovation in how human labor could be organized and how complex products could be manufactured. The organizational principles and production techniques that emerged in the arsenal influenced manufacturing throughout the world. The facility demonstrated that systematic organization, standardization, and continuous improvement could produce remarkable results. These lessons, learned in the medieval arsenal, eventually transformed how goods are produced throughout the modern world. The arsenal's significance lies not in its specific products or its specific historical moment, but in the principles it demonstrated and the influence those principles exerted on human civilization. Beyond its organizational achievements, the arsenal developed specific technical innovations that influenced maritime technology and manufacturing practices for centuries. These innovations emerged not from theoretical research but from practical experimentation and the accumulated experience of generations of craftsmen and engineers. The technical achievements of the arsenal merit examination because they demonstrate how practical problem-solving can produce innovations with far-reaching consequences. The development of standardized hull designs represented one of the arsenal's most significant technical contributions. Rather than designing each ship individually, the arsenal developed a limited number of standardized designs that could be modified slightly for specific purposes. These designs reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge about what hull shapes performed well in different conditions. Standardized designs allowed the arsenal to produce ships more efficiently because workers did not need to adapt their work to unique designs. Standardized designs also allowed for quality control. Ships built to the same design should perform similarly. Other shipbuilders eventually adopted the principle of standardized designs. This principle eventually influenced how other products were designed and manufactured. The arsenal's innovations in fastening techniques represented another significant technical contribution. Medieval shipbuilders used wooden pegs and iron nails to hold planks together, but the arsenal developed more sophisticated fastening systems. The facility experimented with different fastening patterns, different nail sizes, and different materials. Through experimentation, arsenal craftsmen discovered which fastening techniques produced the strongest joints and the most durable ships. These innovations improved ship durability and seaworthiness. The knowledge about effective fastening techniques spread to other shipbuilders through various channels, visiting shipbuilders, written descriptions, and captured ships that other builders could study and learn from. The development of improved caulking techniques represented another area of technical innovation. Caulking, filling the seams between planks with fibers and tar, was essential for preventing water from entering the hull. The arsenal experimented with different materials and techniques to improve caulking effectiveness. Craftsmen discovered which materials provided the best waterproofing. They developed techniques for applying caulking materials that produced more durable seals. They learned how to inspect caulking work to ensure quality. These innovations improved ships' seaworthiness and longevity. The knowledge about effective caulking spread to other shipbuilders. The arsenal's innovations in timber selection and treatment also influenced maritime technology. The facility developed sophisticated knowledge about which timber types performed best for different purposes. Arsenal specialists could identify which trees produced the strongest wood for hulls, which produced the most flexible wood for planking, which produced the straightest wood for masts. The arsenal also developed techniques for treating timber to improve durability and resistance to rot. These innovations improved ship durability. The knowledge about timber selection and treatment spread to other shipbuilders and influenced how timber was used in other industries. The development of improved rigging systems represented another area of technical innovation. The arsenal experimented with different rope configurations, different attachment points, and different materials. Through experimentation, arsenal craftsmen discovered which rigging configurations provided the best control of sails and the most stable support for masts. These innovations improved ship maneuverability and safety. The knowledge about effective rigging systems spread to other shipbuilders and influenced how sailing ships were rigged throughout Europe. The arsenal's innovations in mechanical devices for ship launching represented another significant technical contribution. Moving a completed ship from the building where it had been constructed to the water required sophisticated mechanical systems. The arsenal developed systems of pulleys, levers, and friction devices that allowed workers to control the descent of ships down slipways. These mechanical systems allowed ships to be launched safely and efficiently. The principles underlying these mechanical systems influenced how other heavy objects were moved and manipulated in other contexts. The development of improved tool designs represented another area of technical innovation. The arsenal did not simply use tools that craftsmen had used for centuries. Instead, arsenal managers worked with tool makers to develop improved tools that made work faster and more precise. The facility developed specialized tools for specific tasks. These tools had been refined through generations of use and experimentation. The knowledge about effective tool design spread to other craftsmen and influenced how tools were designed in other trades. The arsenal's innovations in production scheduling and coordination represented another significant technical contribution. The facility developed procedures for coordinating the work of thousands of workers across multiple specialized sections. This required careful planning about the sequence of work, the timing of material deliveries, and the allocation of workers to different tasks. The arsenal developed scheduling procedures that allowed work to proceed efficiently without bottlenecks or delays. These scheduling principles influenced how other large production facilities organized their work. The development of quality control procedures represented another area of technical innovation. The arsenal developed systematic procedures for inspecting work at various stages of production to ensure that it met established standards. Inspectors evaluated whether components met specifications for dimensions, materials, and workmanship. If components did not meet standards, they were rejected and the worker had to correct them or produce replacements. These quality control procedures ensured that defective components did not proceed to later stages of production. The principles underlying these quality control procedures influenced how other manufacturers approached quality control. The arsenal's innovations in record keeping and documentation represented another significant technical contribution. The facility maintained detailed records of production metrics, worker performance, material consumption, and other operational data. These records allowed managers to analyze productivity and identify inefficiencies. The records also created a permanent documentation of production knowledge that did not depend on individual workers' memory. The principles underlying these record-keeping practices influenced how other organizations documented their operations and knowledge. The development of improved sail designs represented another area of technical innovation. The Arsenal experimented with different sail shapes, different materials, and different construction techniques. Through experimentation, Arsenal craftsmen discovered which sail designs provided the best performance in different wind conditions. These innovations improved ship performance under sail. The knowledge about effective sail designs spread to other sail makers and influenced how sails were designed and constructed throughout Europe. The Arsenal's innovations in anchor design and production represented another significant technical contribution. Anchors were essential equipment for ships, and their design influenced how effectively ships could be secured in different conditions. The Arsenal experimented with different anchor designs and developed techniques for producing anchors that were strong and reliable. These innovations improved ship safety and operational capability. The knowledge about effective anchor designs spread to other anchor makers and influenced how anchors were designed and produced. The development of improved navigation equipment represented another area of technical innovation. The Arsenal produced compasses, astrolabes, and other instruments that helped navigators determine their position and course. These instruments incorporated innovations in materials, design, and manufacturing techniques. The Arsenal's innovations in navigation equipment contributed to improvements in maritime navigation throughout Europe. The Arsenal's innovations in ship design for specific purposes represented another significant technical contribution. The facility developed specialized designs for warships optimized for speed and maneuverability, merchant ships optimized for cargo capacity, and galleys designed for Mediterranean conditions. These specialized designs reflected deep understanding of how different design characteristics influence ship performance. The knowledge about specialized ship designs spread to other shipbuilders and influenced how ships were designed for different purposes. The development of improved waterproofing techniques represented another area of technical innovation. Beyond caulking, the Arsenal experimented with different materials and techniques for protecting wood from water damage and rot. Arsenal craftsmen discovered which materials provided the best protection and how to apply them effectively. These innovations improved ship durability and longevity. The knowledge about effective waterproofing techniques spread to other shipbuilders and influenced how wood was protected in other contexts. The Arsenal's innovations in labour productivity represented another significant technical contribution. The facility developed techniques for organising work that allowed workers to accomplish more in less time. These techniques included standardization of procedures, specialization of labour, and systematic management. The principles underlying these productivity techniques influenced how other organizations organized their work and managed their labour. The cumulative effect of these technical innovations was to create a body of knowledge about shipbuilding that was more sophisticated and more systematically organized than anything that had existed before. This knowledge was recorded in written and visual form, allowing it to be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The knowledge was also actively shared with other shipbuilders through various channels. The result was that maritime technology throughout Europe gradually incorporated innovations that had emerged in the Arsenal. The Arsenal's technical innovations also influenced how other industries approached technical problems. The principles of systematic experimentation, careful documentation, and continuous improvement that the Arsenal had pioneered influenced how craftsmen in other trades approached their work. The Arsenal demonstrated that technical problems could be solved through systematic investigation and experimentation rather than through reliance on tradition alone. This approach to technical problem solving eventually became standard in manufacturing and engineering throughout Europe. The Arsenalotti occupy a distinctive place in the history of labour and social organisation. These workers, employed permanently by the state to perform specialised labour according to standardised procedures, represented a new category of worker that had no clear precedent in medieval Europe. Understanding the Arsenalotti provides insights into how labour was organised, how workers responded to their circumstances, and how collective action emerged among workers facing common challenges. The Arsenalotti came from diverse social backgrounds. Some were sons of craftsmen who had worked in the arsenal for generations. Others came from outside Venice, attracted by the prospect of steady employment and regular wages. The arsenal recruited workers from throughout the Mediterranean region. Young men seeking economic opportunity could apply for positions. If accepted, they entered a workplace that offered stability and the possibility of advancement that most medieval workers could not expect. This attracted ambitious individuals seeking to improve their circumstances. The wages paid to Arsenalotti workers varied considerably based on skill level and experience. A master carpenter might earn 3 or 4 times what an unskilled labourer earned. However, even the lowest paid Arsenalotti workers earned more than many other medieval workers. The arsenal provided regular employment and predictable income. For workers from poor backgrounds, this represented a significant improvement over the precarious existence of day labourers or agricultural workers. The arsenal therefore attracted workers seeking economic security. The arsenal also offered benefits beyond wages. Workers received tools and materials. They did not need to purchase their own equipment, as independent craftsmen did. The arsenal maintained workshops that were relatively safe and well organised compared to other medieval workplaces. The arsenal provided some medical care for injured workers. Most significantly, the arsenal offered job security. Workers who performed their duties competently could expect to retain their positions. This was not guaranteed employment in the modern sense, but it represented a level of stability that most medieval workers could not expect. The Arsenalotti developed a strong sense of collective identity. They recognized themselves as a distinct group within Venetian society, neither independent masters nor servants, but skilled workers employed by the state. This collective identity eventually manifested in organized action. By the 15th century, the Arsenalotti had begun to organize collectively to protect their interests. They negotiated with arsenal management over wages and working conditions. They coordinated their actions to resist what they perceived as unjust treatment. In some cases, they refused to work until their demands were met. These actions represented early forms of labour organisation, predating the modern labour movement by centuries. The organisation of the Arsenalotti reflected their position as permanent state employees. Unlike independent craftsmen who worked for themselves, or journeymen who worked for individual masters, the Arsenalotti worked for a large, bureaucratic organisation. This meant that individual workers could not easily negotiate directly with their employer. Instead, they had to organise collectively to have their voices heard. The arsenal's size and bureaucratic structure therefore created conditions that encouraged collective organisation among workers. The Arsenalotti's collective actions sometimes achieved significant results. In some cases, workers successfully negotiated for higher wages or improved working conditions. In other cases, their actions resulted in punishments or dismissals. The arsenal's managers viewed collective action by workers as a threat to their authority and control. They sometimes responded harshly to worker organising. Yet despite these risks, the Arsenalotti continued to organise collectively when they perceived that their interests were threatened. The Arsenalotti's collective organisation also reflected their shared interests as workers. All Arsenalotti workers depended on employment in the arsenal for their livelihood. All faced similar working conditions and similar challenges. All had incentives to maintain employment and improve their circumstances. These shared interests created the basis for collective organisation. Workers understood that collective action might achieve results that individual action could not. The Arsenalotti's collective organisation also reflected their understanding of their own value. These workers possessed skills that the arsenal needed. The arsenal depended on their labour to produce ships. Workers understood that the arsenal could not function without them. This understanding gave workers leverage. If they refused to work, The arsenal could not produce ships. This leverage motivated workers to organize collectively and use the threat of work stoppage to negotiate for better conditions. The relationship between the Arsenalotti and Arsenal management reflected broader patterns in how labour was organised in medieval and early modern Europe. Management sought to control labour and maximise productivity. Workers sought to protect their interests and improve their circumstances. These competing interests created tension. The Arsenal's managers developed procedures for disciplining workers who violated rules or performed poorly. Workers responded by organising collectively to resist what they perceived as unjust treatment. The result was an ongoing negotiation between management and workers over wages, working conditions, and the terms of employment. The Arsenalotti's experience also reflected how permanent employment created new forms of social organisation. In medieval craft production, workers and masters maintained personal relationships. An apprentice worked for a specific master and learned from that master. A journeyman worked for a specific master and might eventually become a master himself. These personal relationships created social bonds and created pathways for advancement. In the arsenal, by contrast, workers were employed by a large, bureaucratic organisation. Personal relationships between individual workers and individual managers were less important. Instead, workers related to the arsenal as an institution. This institutional relationship created different forms of social organisation. The Arsenalotti also developed their own social institutions and practices. Workers formed associations and mutual aid societies. They organised celebrations and festivals. They developed traditions and customs that marked their identity as Arsenalotti. These social institutions reflected their sense of collective identity and their desire to maintain community bonds despite the impersonal nature of their employment relationship. The Arsenalotti's social institutions represented an early form of working-class culture that would become more developed as industrial manufacturing spread. The Arsenalotti's experience also reflected how permanent employment created new forms of social stratification. Within the arsenal, workers occupied different positions based on skill level and experience. Master craftsmen occupied higher positions than journeymen, who occupied higher positions than apprentices and labourers. This hierarchy created status differences among workers. Some workers aspired to advance to higher positions. Others accepted their current positions. This internal stratification within the working class reflected patterns that would become more pronounced in industrial manufacturing. The Arsenalotti's relationship to Venice's broader society also reflected their distinctive position. These workers occupied a middle ground between the merchant elite, who controlled Venice, and the poor labourers who worked in other industries. The Arsenalotti possessed skills and received regular wages. They were not wealthy, but they were not desperately poor. They occupied a position that resembled what would later be called the middle class. This position gave the Arsenalotti a stake in Venice's stability and prosperity. They benefited from Venice's success and suffered from Venice's decline. The Arsenalotti's experience also reflected how permanent employment created new forms of dependency. Workers depended on the arsenal for employment and income. The arsenal depended on workers for labour. This mutual dependency created a relationship that was more complex than simple exploitation. The arsenal had incentives to treat workers reasonably because it needed to maintain a stable workforce. Workers had incentives to perform their duties competently because they depended on the arsenal for their livelihood. This mutual dependency created a relationship that resembled modern employment relationships more closely than medieval craft relationships did. The Arsenalotti's collective organisation also reflected how permanent employment created new forms of conflict. In medieval craft production, conflicts between masters and workers were limited because workers could potentially become masters themselves. In the arsenal, workers could not easily become managers. The hierarchy between workers and management was more rigid. This created the potential for more sustained conflict between workers and management. The Arsenalotti's collective organisation represented one form of response to this conflict. The Arsenalotti's experience also influenced how other workers in Venice and other cities approached labour organisation. As other industries in Venice adopted organisational principles similar to those used in the arsenal, workers in these industries also began to organise collectively. The Arsenalotti's example demonstrated that workers could organise effectively to protect their interests. This example influenced how workers in other industries approached labour organisation. The Arsenalotti's experience also reflected how permanent employment created new forms of social mobility. In medieval craft production, advancement from apprentice to journeyman to master followed relatively predictable pathways. In the arsenal, advancement depended more on individual performance and management decisions. This created both opportunities and uncertainties. Workers who performed well and gained management favour could advance to better positions. Workers who performed poorly or fell out of favour could be demoted or dismissed. This created incentives for workers to perform well, but also created anxieties about job security. The Arsenalotti's collective organisation also reflected how permanent employment created new forms of solidarity among workers. Workers who performed different tasks in different sections of the arsenal developed a sense of common identity based on their shared status as arsenal workers. This solidarity extended across skill levels and specializations. Master craftsmen and unskilled labourers recognized themselves as part of the same group, the Arsenalotti. This solidarity created the basis for collective action that transcended individual interests. The Arsenalotti's experience ultimately demonstrated that permanent employment by large organizations created conditions that encouraged collective organization among workers. Workers employed by the arsenal could not easily negotiate individually with management. They had to organize collectively to have their voices heard. The arsenal's size and bureaucratic structure created the conditions for this collective organization. The Arsenalotti's experience therefore anticipated patterns that would become more pronounced as industrial manufacturing spread and workers increasingly found themselves employed by large organizations rather than working independently or for individual masters. The arsenal's influence on modern manufacturing and management extends far beyond historical interest. The organizational principles and production techniques that emerged in the arsenal during the medieval period became foundational to how modern manufacturing operates. Understanding this legacy illuminates not only historical development, but also contemporary practices that shape how goods are produced throughout the world today. The principle of division of labour, pioneered by the arsenal, became central to industrial manufacturing. Adam Smith, the 18th century economist, famously described how division of labour increased productivity in pin manufacturing. Yet the arsenal had demonstrated this principle centuries earlier. By dividing the shipbuilding process into specialised tasks, the arsenal allowed workers to develop expertise in specific functions. This specialisation increased productivity and allowed the arsenal to train workers more quickly than traditional apprenticeship systems required. Modern manufacturing continues to rely on division of labour as a fundamental principle. Workers in factories perform specialised tasks. This specialisation increases productivity and allows workers to become proficient relatively quickly. The principle of standardization, developed by the arsenal, became equally central to industrial manufacturing. The arsenal standardized component dimensions, production procedures, and quality standards. This standardization allowed components produced at different times to fit together reliably. It allowed quality to be controlled systematically. It reduced the role of individual judgment and created predictability. Modern manufacturing relies extensively on standardization. Products are manufactured to consistent specifications. Components are interchangeable. Quality is controlled through systematic procedures. These practices trace back to innovations that the arsenal pioneered. The principle of systematic management developed by the Arsenal became foundational to modern management theory and practice. The Arsenal maintained hierarchical management structures. Supervisors oversaw workers and ensured compliance with procedures. Managers coordinated the work of different sections. Records were maintained of production metrics and worker performance. These management practices reflected a systematic approach to organizing labor. Modern management continues to rely on hierarchical structures, systematic procedures, and detailed record keeping. These practices trace back to organizational innovations that the Arsenal pioneered. The principle of continuous improvement developed by the Arsenal became central to modern manufacturing and management. The Arsenal did not view production as static. Managers and workers continuously sought ways to improve efficiency, quality, and productivity. They experimented with new designs and techniques. They analyzed production data to identify inefficiencies. They implemented improvements based on their analysis. Modern manufacturing continues to emphasize continuous improvement. Kaizen, lean manufacturing, and other modern management approaches emphasize systematic improvement of processes and products. These approaches reflect principles that the Arsenal had pioneered centuries earlier. The principle of quality control developed by the Arsenal became central to industrial manufacturing. The Arsenal maintained systematic procedures for inspecting work at various stages of production. Components that did not meet standards were rejected. This ensured that defective components did not proceed to later stages of production. Modern manufacturing relies extensively on quality control procedures. Products are inspected at various stages of production. Defective products are identified and corrected. These quality control practices trace back to procedures that the Arsenal had developed. The principle of supply chain management developed by the Arsenal became central to modern manufacturing. The Arsenal coordinated the production and delivery of materials and components from multiple suppliers. It maintained inventories of materials at various stages of completion. It coordinated the timing of different production activities to ensure that materials arrived when needed. Modern manufacturing relies extensively on supply chain management. Materials and components are coordinated to arrive when needed. Inventories are managed to balance availability against storage costs. These supply chain management practices trace back to procedures that the Arsenal had developed. The principle of technical documentation developed by the Arsenal became central to industrial manufacturing. The Arsenal created detailed written and visual specifications for ships. These specifications allowed workers to understand exactly what they needed to produce. They created a permanent record of design knowledge. Modern manufacturing relies extensively on technical documentation. Blueprints, specifications, and technical drawings guide production. These documents create permanent records of design knowledge. These practices trace back to innovations that the Arsenal had pioneered. The principle of worker training and skill development, developed by the Arsenal, became central to industrial manufacturing. The Arsenal developed systematic procedures for training workers in specific tasks. Workers could become productive relatively quickly through proper instruction in standardized procedures. Modern manufacturing continues to emphasize systematic worker training. Workers receive formal training in the procedures they need to follow. This allows workers to become productive relatively quickly. These training practices trace back to approaches that the Arsenal had pioneered. The principle of productivity measurement and analysis developed by the Arsenal became central to modern management. The Arsenal maintained detailed records of production metrics. Managers analyzed these records to understand productivity and identify inefficiencies. Modern management continues to emphasize measurement and analysis. Organizations measure productivity, quality, costs, and other metrics. Managers analyze this data to identify opportunities for improvement. These measurement and analysis practices trace back to procedures that the Arsenal had developed. The relationship between workers and employers pioneered by the Arsenal, became standard in industrial manufacturing. The Arsenalotti sold their labour for wages. They worked according to procedures established by management. They lacked ownership of their products, yet they also possessed certain protections and job security. This employment relationship eventually became standard in industrial manufacturing. Workers are employed by organizations for wages. They work according to procedures established by management. They lack ownership of products, yet they possess certain protections and legal rights. This employment relationship traces back to patterns that emerged in the Arsenal. The principle of state ownership and operation of production facilities, pioneered by the Arsenal, became standard practice in many nations. Governments throughout the world developed government-owned arsenals, shipyards, and weapons factories. These facilities adopted organizational principles that the Arsenal had pioneered. The principle that governments could own and operate production facilities to manufacture military equipment reflected the Arsenal's model. This principle influenced how governments approached military procurement and production. The principle of specialized facilities designed for specific production tasks, developed by the Arsenal, became central to industrial manufacturing. The Arsenal organized its physical space to support specific production functions. Different sections handled different tasks. The physical layout reflected careful planning about workflow and efficiency. Modern manufacturing continues to organize facilities based on production functions. Different sections handle different tasks. The physical layout reflects planning about workflow and efficiency. These facility design practices trace back to innovations that the Arsenal had pioneered. The principle of mechanical systems to supplement human labor, developed by the Arsenal, became central to industrial manufacturing. The Arsenal developed systems of pulleys and levers that allowed workers to move heavy materials more easily. These mechanical systems did not replace human labor, but made work more efficient. Industrial manufacturing eventually developed more sophisticated mechanical systems and eventually automated equipment. Yet the underlying principle, using mechanical systems to supplement and enhance human labor, traces back to innovations that the Arsenal had pioneered. The principle of innovation driven by practical necessity, demonstrated by the Arsenal, became central to how modern organizations approach innovation. The Arsenal emerged because Venice faced a practical problem that required a practical solution. The innovations that emerged from this necessity eventually transformed manufacturing throughout the world. Modern organizations often innovate in response to practical challenges. The principle that practical necessity can drive innovation that eventually transforms entire industries reflects patterns that the Arsenal had demonstrated. The Arsenal's influence on modern manufacturing extends to how organizations approach competitive advantage. The Arsenal demonstrated that organizational capability could provide competitive advantage. Venice's naval dominance depended not on superior resources, but on superior organization. Modern organizations continue to recognize that organizational capability provides competitive advantage. Companies compete not only on price, but on how efficiently they can organize production. The principle that organizational capability provides competitive advantage traces back to lessons that the Arsenal had demonstrated. The Arsenal's influence on modern management also extends to how organizations approach knowledge management. The Arsenal recognized that knowledge about production could be recorded in written and visual form and transmitted to workers. This knowledge could be preserved and improved over time. Modern organizations continue to emphasize knowledge management. Organizations capture knowledge about processes and procedures. They document this knowledge in written and visual form. They transmit this knowledge to new workers. These knowledge management practices trace back to approaches that the Arsenal had pioneered. The Arsenal's legacy in modern manufacturing ultimately reflects how organizational innovation can transform human capabilities. The Arsenal demonstrated that systematic organization, standardization, and continuous improvement could produce remarkable results. These principles, learned in the medieval Arsenal, eventually transformed manufacturing throughout the world. Modern manufacturing, despite its sophisticated technology and mechanization, continues to rely on organizational principles that the arsenal pioneered centuries ago. The arsenal's historical significance lies not merely in its specific achievements, but in the principles it demonstrated and the influence those principles exerted on how production is organized throughout the modern world. Examining the arsenal in comparison with other medieval production systems illuminates what made the arsenal distinctive and what it shared with broader patterns of medieval manufacturing. This comparative perspective reveals both the arsenal's unique achievements and the broader context within which it operated. Medieval Europe produced goods through multiple systems of organization. In some regions, craft guilds controlled production. Guild members were independent craftsmen who owned their tools and materials. They worked in small workshops, often with one or two apprentices or journeymen. Production occurred at small scale, with individual craftsmen producing goods for local markets. Quality and production rates varied, depending on individual craftsmen's skill and effort. The arsenal operated on fundamentally different principles. The facility was owned and operated by the state. Workers did not own their tools or materials. They did not work independently, but according to procedures established by management. They did not control entry into their trade or the terms of their employment. Some medieval cities developed large textile workshops that employed dozens or hundreds of workers. These workshops divided labor into specialized tasks. Workers performed specific functions under the direction of managers. Yet these textile workshops typically remained under the control of merchant families or guilds rather than the state. They did not achieve the same level of systematic organization that the arsenal developed. They did not maintain the same level of detailed record-keeping or quality control procedures. Agricultural production systems that dominated medieval Europe relied on feudal relationships. Peasants worked land owned by lords in exchange for protection and use of the land. Labor was organized according to feudal hierarchies and seasonal rhythms. Production occurred at small scale, with individual peasant families producing primarily for their own consumption and local markets. The systematic organization of labor, standardization of procedures, and focus on large-scale production for external markets distinguished the arsenal from agricultural systems fundamentally. Mining operations in medieval Europe employed significant numbers of workers. Yet mining typically relied on coerced labor, slaves, prisoners, or workers bound by debt. Mining operations did not develop the systematic organization of labor that the arsenal pioneered. They did not maintain detailed records or develop standardized procedures. The approach to organizing free labor according to systematic procedures set the arsenal apart from how mining operations organized coerced labor. Medieval powers maintained workshops that produced weapons and military equipment. These workshops typically remained small and did not achieve the scale or sophistication of the arsenal. They did not develop the same level of systematic organization or standardization. The arsenal's achievements in military production reflected not only its own innovations, but also Venice's merchant culture, which valued efficiency and systematic organization in ways that feudal societies did not. The Islamic world had developed sophisticated production systems in various industries. Some Islamic cities had developed large workshops that employed many workers. Yet these workshops typically remained under the control of individual merchants or merchant families rather than the state. They did not achieve the same level of state ownership and control that the arsenal represented. State ownership and operation distinguished the arsenal from production systems in the Islamic world. Venice's unique position in medieval Europe explained much of the arsenal's distinctiveness. Venice was a merchant republic that depended entirely on maritime commerce. The city's government was controlled by merchant families who understood commerce and production in ways that feudal lords did not. This merchant perspective influenced how Venice approached the arsenal. The city viewed the arsenal not as a feudal obligation, but as an investment that would produce returns. This commercial perspective on production influenced how the arsenal was organized and managed. The specific challenge that Venice faced also drove the arsenal's development. The city needed to build many ships quickly. This urgent practical challenge forced innovation. Traditional craft production could not meet this demand. The arsenal emerged as a response to this practical challenge. The innovations that emerged from this challenge, standardization, specialization, systematic management, eventually transformed manufacturing throughout the world. Venice's geographic position and resources shaped the arsenal's significance. Venice lacked agricultural land and natural resources. The city depended entirely on trade and maritime commerce. This dependence created incentives to organize production efficiently. The arsenal represented an investment in maintaining Venice's competitive advantage in maritime commerce. The city invested substantial resources in the arsenal because it understood that the facility's productivity provided strategic advantage. Comparing the arsenal with other medieval production systems reveals that the arsenal represented a significant innovation in how production could be organized. Yet the arsenal did not emerge in isolation. It reflected broader patterns of medieval development. Cities were growing, commerce was expanding, production was becoming more complex. These broader trends created conditions that encouraged innovation in production organization. The arsenal represented one response to these broader trends, but it was not the only response. Other cities eventually developed production systems that incorporated some of the arsenal's organizational principles. Yet during the medieval period, no other facility matched the arsenal's combination of scale, sophistication, and productivity. The arsenal's achievements reflected not only its own innovations, but also the resources that Venice invested in the facility. Venice's wealth, derived from maritime commerce, allowed the city to invest in the arsenal. This investment produced returns in the form of naval superiority that protected Venice's commercial interests. Innovation typically emerges in response to practical challenges. The arsenal emerged because Venice faced a practical challenge that existing production methods could not address. The innovations that emerged from this challenge reflected practical problem-solving rather than abstract theorizing. This pattern, where practical necessity drives innovation, has repeated throughout history. Understanding this pattern illuminates how innovation occurs in contemporary contexts as well. The Arsenal of Venice stands as a monument to human ingenuity and systematic thinking. For nearly 5 centuries, this facility demonstrated that ordinary people, organized thoughtfully and directed purposefully, could accomplish extraordinary things. The workers who labored within those walls did not understand themselves as revolutionaries or innovators. They simply performed their assigned tasks according to established procedures. Yet collectively, their efforts transformed how human societies could organize production at scale. The arsenal's decline did not diminish its historical significance. The facility that once dominated Mediterranean shipbuilding eventually yielded to changing circumstances and new competitors. Yet the principles it pioneered persisted: standardization, specialization, systematic management, continuous improvement. These innovations spread throughout Europe and eventually throughout the world. They became foundational to industrial manufacturing. They shaped how modern organizations operate across countless industries and contexts. The arsenal also teaches that organizational capability matters profoundly. Venice's naval dominance derived not from superior resources, but from superior organization. This principle extends far beyond shipbuilding. Organizations that systematically organize labor, maintain clear procedures, and continuously improve their operations outperform competitors possessing greater resources but inferior organization. The arsenal provides historical evidence that organizational capability provides competitive advantage.